Sacred Heart is proud to sponsor Pensacola Histories in recognition of the Daughters of Charity who brought their mission of care to Pensacola over 90 years ago.
Hello and welcome to our continuing story of Pensacola, North America's first place city. In these episodes, we're talking about the influence of care and compassion here in our society in Escambia County in Pensacola. You know, if you had been born in the year 1900, you would have had a life expectancy of about 47 years. By the time we reached the year 2000, that number had virtually reversed itself, and the life expectancy then was about 74 years. And all of these things were possible because of many forms of medical practice, diet, and so forth, but also care and compassion, our willingness to help others, had a large measure of meaning for those statistics as well. Today, I want to start our story by talking about something that happened here in the late 1890s. By that time, our community here in Pensacola was a rough and ready boom town. Lots of things were happening that, well, today we probably might not be too proud of. And as a result of this, we were finding a great number of orphans. We were finding a substantial number of little children, little infants actually, that were literally being abandoned. And this was disturbing to people in the church community, and yet they had no way to deal with it on a mass basis. And this came to be a passion for a lady named Pearl Egan. Now, Mrs. Egan was the wife of the local postmaster, John Egan. John was also a member of our legislature. And Mrs. Egan said, this is something about which we must take action. And so she put together a small group of friends from her church, and they went to men of means, men like Francis Brent and William Chipley and William Knowles and some of the others. And they said, look, we've got a problem. We need to do something. Let's put together something where we can care for these abandoned children. And the men agreed. Mr. Chipley was the one that gave a piece of property on North Balin Street. The others pitched in with dollars. And so in 1896, what became known as the Pearl Egan Home was established to do just exactly what Mrs. Egan had laid out. Unfortunately, that good lady died just a little over a year later, but her good friend Bessie Flynn, who had been part of the organizing committee, took charge, and the Pearl Egan Home prospered. Now, I'm not going to give you the whole story of what happened step by step, but today, our Children's Home Society, both of Pensacola and of Florida, are direct descendants of the Pearl Egan Home. What they are doing carried on from what Pearl envisioned back in the 1890s. Well, as we move forward, we find that as we get close to the year 1900, we find a kind of an epidemic coming upon, not the women, not the children, but this time on influential and affluent men. Because those of you who like to look at old photographs will remember that a great many of the pictures that you see of some of these people show them with handsome mustaches and whiskers, but they also are very corpulent. They're big men. So being 250 or 260 pounds was a badge of success. Well, we all know in the 21st century that also was a badge of danger, because one by one these people were dropping over at the age of 50 or 55 of heart attacks, of stroke. And by the time we get into the early 1890s, some of these men began to realize that they had to do something about their weight. And so they created what we would today call a health club. They built a handsome building down on North Balin Street, and it was equipped with all of the things that you would think might be used for that purpose, the weights and the measures, and on the track around the top, all of the things that they could use, and it was quite successful. And a few years later, of course, as we moved into the 20th century, the whole community was beginning to be caught up in this. And so, since the other was a private organization, they realized they could not take care of the mass of people they wanted. So the men who had formed this health club gave the building to the Elks Club, to the Odd Fellows Lodge, and they in turn gave it a new name. They called it Rayford Hall, and that Rayford Hall became one of our antique buildings along Balin Street until it burned, unfortunately, about 30 years ago. But what was happening, of course, to the men in the health club was this. About this same time, a wide group of men came together and said, look, there is a movement afoot in the United States to address the very problem that we're talking about, and it's called the Young Men's Christian Association, the YMCA. We ought to have a chapter of the Y here. And so, beginning in early 1903, they brought together the sufficient funds to do this work. They bought a lot on North Palafox Street, and they engaged a young man who had been trained for YMCA work. His name was John Sherrill. And Mr. Sherrill came in, because this little book here that we did a few years ago tells the story of the YMCA in Pensacola, which, of course, beginning in 1903, was the first, what I would call, organized, compassionate agency that we had. And in exactly that same year, the community got its second agency of this time, and that, of course, was the Salvation Army. Salvation Army dated back some 30 years to its beginnings in London. Chapters had organized in Boston, and now the idea was spreading down the coastline. And the Salvation Army came to Pensacola, and they acquired a piece of property on West Government Street, and that's where they built their first small headquarters. And they went into business also in 1903. Their mission was quite different from the YMCA, however. They were there to spread a Christian gospel, and also to care for people who were homeless, who needed help outside of the normal chain of things which could be afforded by the community. Well, as we move into the next few years, Pensacola goes through a difficult period. I think in another episode we've told you about the final epidemic of yellow fever, which we suffered in 1905, and how that at the end of that, the only hospital that we had closed down. A new hospital called the Pensacola Infirmary was opened here in 1905, and it continued on for about 10 years. It was small, it was proprietary, it was run by a group of local physicians with a man named Clarence Hutchinson as its head. But by the time they got to 1914, these men realized that this just wasn't adequate. People were getting sick. We had a population well over 20,000. Something had to be done. And so these men, with the concurrence of the city council and with Father Kennedy, who was the senior Catholic priest at the time, they put together a plan and went to Emmitsburg, Maryland, where they approached the Daughters of Charity, asking if those daughters would come to Pensacola, build, and then run a first-class hospital. Well, the sisters debated. The city council said, we'll provide a square block of land on 12th Avenue. The Chamber of Commerce and others raised $10,000 as seed money, and sure enough, the daughters agreed. And so beginning in 1915, Sacred Heart Hospital was built and began its very fine and enduring career for us here. And 2 years later, the sisters also opened a school of nursing, because up to that time we had precious few really trained nurses working here within our medical community. Okay, we move forward to the year 1924. By now we've added some additional activities here which were beginning to help people in compassion. One of these dealt with sight, with eyes. In 1919, the Pensacola had gained its chapter of the Lions Club. Lions had as a national goal help to people with sight problems, either needing glasses or examinations or any special problem. And so the Lions had opened what they called a sight clinic in a little building which one of their members owned. Two of their members were ophthalmologists or optometrists, and these people, of course, provided free service, and the Lions Club now had their sight clinic. Almost exactly at the same time, the new, recently organized chapter of the Kiwanis Club did pretty much the same thing, only they were going to deal with what they called a general clinic that would help people who were without means. If people came there with any kind of minor medical problem, the Kiwanis clinic would take care of them. So by the time we move forward another year, in 1923, we have also operating here the Order of Catholic Charities. And of course, the Catholic Charities was a little different. They were there to offer counseling and financial aid and all sorts of things to people who needed that kind of help, particularly women and children. So by 1924, you've got a growth of this kind of compassionate organization. And each one of them, of course, as it moved forward, each one of them needed money, an annual budget. And so what they were doing, one by one, they would go to business A, business C, business F, and they say, we need to talk to your employees, we need to talk to you, the owner, about giving us some money for support. Well, that was all right at the beginning, but by the time you got to 1924, there were 7 such organizations, each one having a campaign every year, and people were beginning to say, now wait a minute, our employees, they're getting a little bit tired of this. And so at this point in time, something unique happened. By happy chance, The city had gained as citizens just a couple of years before Carl and Agnes Weiss. Now, Mr. Weiss was the co-owner of at that point, the Weiss-Patterson Lumber Company, and a very successful, very compassionate man himself. And his wife was every bit as much interested in people and community. And she happened to go to New York City, and while she was there, she saw something that really rang a bell for her. And this was that she saw what New York was doing to solve the problem that was beginning to rise here. And it was called a community chest. This was an organization which would bring together necessary facilities and planning for a single annual campaign to raise the money so that each one of these deserving agencies would receive funds for them. Perhaps not all that they would need, but certainly a large part of their budget. So in the month of April 1924, the community chest was organized and became a part of our community. Now, I overlooked one agency, and we must go back to that because it's important in our time. I'm getting old. I must be getting forgetful, because in 1917 we had one other agency come on board that, of course, it was part of the community chest, and this, of course, was the American Red Cross. The American Red Cross had been around in the United States for some 20 years by then, but with war clouds beginning to darken here around Pensacola, the people at the Navy and a number of very wise local citizens came together and said, we ought to have a chapter of Red Cross here. They met down in the Blunt Building, held their preliminary sessions, and then they went to the national organization, got the appropriate papers for a charter, and in March of 1917, just before our country entered World War I, we had our chapter of the Red Cross. It was given, Mr. Blunt's estate gave space in the Blunt Building for their headquarters, and they were off and running. And of course, we have had American Red Cross with us in Pensacola and Escambia County ever since. Okay, at about the same time, if you had been alive at that time, just about maybe a month before Christmas, you would have received a very handsome envelope inviting you to buy Christmas seals. Now, the inside of the envelope would have been a kind of a donor coupon, and inside also would have been 2 or 3 pages of the Christmas seals with the famous double cross on the top of it. And of course, the Christmas Seals Fund was being organized to raise money to fight tuberculosis. Tuberculosis was becoming more and more of a national concern, and this idea, organized by physicians in New York City, came on about 1920. That's as close as I can place it here for Pensacola. And from that point forward, the Christmas Seals campaign would be a part of regular annual mailings that you would have received on and on for many years. They had no particular organization locally. This was something of a national mail campaign, but Pensacola was a part of it. Well, we come up to 1933. We're now into the Depression, bad times have come, and tuberculosis, which of course was part of the Christmas Seal program, the goal of care for them, by now we were having TB problems all across the state of Florida. And so at this point, the state of Florida itself, its state health department, decided that they were going to fund the creation of a number of special tuberculosis hospitals. And they designated there would be one here, 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 and they set up the funding to create one here in Pensacola. So out adjacent to where the pest house had been, they now built the first phase of the TB sanitarium. It opened up in the latter part of 1933. It was a small hospital, 5 core wards for it, and of course it was immediately a very successful enterprise for us, because Northwest Florida certainly had its share of tuberculosis patients. But I should mention that by this time, the entire county, Escambia County, had about 40 doctors. And that included those, of course, who were practicing up north in the Century area. And of course, they were very concerned about TB, as they were with hookworm and some of the other things. But by the time we get to the early years of the Depression, these were our concerns, and health and compassionate organizations were rising to try and meet them.